And finally, a few points of detail on the call itself. As I've already said, it's a theme hospital to all the arts and humanities disciplines. And one thing to bear in mind to start with is that it is a proposal, it's an application where you're trying to be persuasive. And you need, first and foremost, to be able to formulate and explain your good idea arising out of this context, out of this framework, out of these particular sets of ideas. You need to explain your bright, original, engaging idea. The assessors will want to know exactly what it is you're proposing and also why they should be as stimulated about your ideas as you are. And I think it's very useful to hear, and I'm very grateful again to Joe for giving the kind of inside track on what it's like to actually be involved in one of these programs, both from the point of view of imagining it in the first place and your kind of bright idea, but also how when you begin the process and you put together your teams, how that itself generates a lot of energy and excitement, and sometimes, complication too. But I'm very grateful for giving a sense. And I think it's helpful to bear all those things in mind in making your own applications. To help to steer you, what we've done in the call text is to list a number of possible themes and questions to be addressed by Cultural Encounters projects. Now, this is not meant to be a prescriptive or exhaustive list in any way. It was a list put together by the different sort of partners from the network, everybody thinking about different suggestions about the kinds of things that applications might, or sort of lines of inquiry that applications might make. But it is not intended, like I say, to be prescriptive. It's only suggestive. The first area is what we've called cultural encounters over time and space. That is, encounters from historical and geographical perspectives, I suppose, and cultural change in terms of its complex role as a response to an agent of cultural encounters. And here we've suggested some possible questions within that general frame of cultural encounters over time and space. For instance, the role of cultural encounters in the creation of what are in some areas called social imaginaries, or in other areas maybe called imagined communities. How do cultures, stimulate or contribute to the creation of these things? Or, what other sort of impacts do encounters have on imagined communities or social imaginaries that are already in place? We'd be very interested in hearing about the people's research into the drivers, the motivations, the stimulations to cultural encounters. What causes cultural encounters in the first place? Things like the contribution of the arts to cultural encounters. How do artistic practices, creative practices, contribute to those experiences? What are the cultural transformations that arise as a result of the encounter among or between cultures? There are also interesting questions around the, if you like, lessons of cultural encounters for shaping societal values. What does research into cultural encounters tell us about the way in which cultural encounters shape values held widely in society? And also this final question here on the cultural consequences of globalization. Globalization understood, of course, in a contemporary sense, but also reading back into history. The effect of globalization or globalized or globalizing encounters is an area that's of interest. A second general sort of theme or set of questions has to do with what we've called social and political dimensions of cultural encounters. And as you'll even see from looking at these questions, there are overlaps. Again, these are not meant to be entirely separate and discrete questions, but it's really just orientations we're trying to provide here. Here, the questions might focus on describing and researching particular historical models of cultural integration. How does integration arise out of cultural encounters? How does it deal with cultural encounters? What's the impact of forms of integration, both successful and unsuccessful in historical perspective? Another interesting question would be the dynamics between processes of integration, in other words, cultures coming together, and difference, where cultures do not necessarily integrate for whatever reasons and with whatever consequences. The influence of policy itself on cultural encounters, both in causing cultural encounters or encouraging cultural encounters, or in trying to deal with the effects of cultural encounters. And that leads also to important sort of theoretical and philosophical as well as practical concepts of tolerance and pluralism, and how these ideas and practices are related to the experience of cultural encounter. There may also be interesting work to be done in terms of language, particularly linguistic diversity as an aspect of cultural difference and cultural encounters, the effects of languages encountering each other, effects both socially and in terms of policy implications, and concepts of identity, belonging, and citizenship. What effects do cultural encounters have upon these? And one third area that we've described as a focus area has, in a sense, I suppose, to do with maybe the more creative or perhaps arts area, which has to do with translation and interpretation and what's especially in Europe is called mediatization. And here, questions about the adaptation of cultural practices as a result of cultural encounters. What happens to cultural practices when new cultures come into contact with each other? The transformative effects of particular dimensions of encounters, like translation. Cultural encounters as a stimulus to creativity. Where has that happened? When has it happened? And with what impact? Music, art, performance, and literature as I've said before, either potential barriers to cultural encounter or communication or integration, or as facilitators of those things. And finally, the general effects of different forms of media, digital and otherwise, historical forms of media as well, the effects of media itself on cultural encounters. So like I say, these are very general, just steering points. They're not intended to be, there's no checklist here for the assessors about whether you've matched up to any of these. This is really just intended to help to stimulate thinking and stimulate people into helping shape their applications. There are a few things, finally, I wanted to just kind of draw your attention to, which are part of the, I suppose, application criteria. They're important values within the HERA JRP itself. Because it is a joint research program, it is thematic, it's also intended to bring together researchers from across Europe, and it's also intended to stimulate as much as possible interdisciplinarity. So these are all key aspects of the constitutional aspects almost of the HERA JRP. The first one, collaboration. In thinking about collaboration and how you collaborate with others, and again, Joe's talk is very interesting and for giving you some indication of some of the things that arise in terms of thinking about collaboration. But collaboration should give a particular added value, as they say, to questions of culture, identity, creativity, and innovation. Collaboration is a way of addressing familiar questions in new ways that would be impossible for an individual researcher. So it's important to try to identify what your project is going to gain by having collaboration. What is it you can do together that you wouldn't be able to do just as isolated individual researchers? And to identify that. The second thing is interdisciplinarity. Now, interdisciplinarity is not in itself a requirement, and I've also said not here a doctrine, exactly. Interdisciplinarity is more like, from our perspective, an ambition to challenge the familiar and the conventional. And it's an idea we think of in terms of something more than simple multidisciplinarity, more than just disciplines sitting side by side. It's a way, an ambition to try to move the boundaries of those disciplines by having them brought into contact with each other. So it's not just combining the insights of these disciplines that might work together, but trying to find ways of reaching insights which actually move those boundaries in some sense. So again, it's an ambition to look for and to see if there are ways in which you can imagine how the different researchers in your project, coming from different disciplines, may be able to produce something genuinely interdisciplinary. Internationalization is also obviously a key value to the HERA projects. It's a requirement. You have to have, Lucy will talk a little bit later on about the actual requirements of the scheme, but you need partners from 3 participating HERA countries. Like interdisciplinarity, research across national boundaries should have the capacity to unfix the assumptions which form the vision limits and comfort zones of specific traditions and identities. So no more than interdisciplinary work should challenge some of the sort of conventions and habits of disciplinary thinking. So too, the international thing should bring you into contact with people from other national research traditions, even, and academic traditions, which will benefit all of you and sort of, in a sense, move you into slightly new areas that you wouldn't have been in before had you not had this sort of collaboration. And then European added value. This is very important. You need to identify this in some way. What is, or why will this multinational research and partnership make a difference? Why is it something that simply can't be done with local or national funding? And this criterion, it's important to recognize, is not just about European topics. To say European added value doesn't mean that your topics, your proposals have to be focused merely on European history, European culture, European cultural encounters. The Europe here means European researchers who work in Europe, wherever they come from. The fact is this is intended to support European researchers investigating the theme of cultural encounters wherever it may occur. So it's about better research being made possible through collaboration among researchers based in Europe. Europe is not the theme. Europe is, in a sense, the context in which the research takes place. And then finally, this issue of transferring and exchanging the knowledge. This is the question of how your research process on their results can be linked with and disseminated to the wider world outside the academy. Now, obviously, in the UK, this area of knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange is something that has been, on the agenda for some time, and I think a lot of researchers in the UK system are more familiar with this than some of the researchers in some of the other partner countries. In some ways, you, as a UK researcher, may be able to partly lead the way and give some specific guidance on these kinds of issues. But it's really also something we would say it's not knowledge exchange and knowledge transfer from the perspective of HERA is not the same as measuring economic impact. It's one of the things we do want you to pay attention to, but it's really about how your research can be disseminated, ways in which it can have some sort of relationship and impact in the wider world.